What happens when the person who promised to love you forever becomes the one who ends your life? What happens when trust shatters in an instant and the love you thought would last forever turns into something darker than you could ever imagine? This is the shocking, tragic story of Kenyata Jones and the murder of his wife. A case that will make you question the very nature of trust and betrayal. A seemingly perfect marriage, a life built on love, laughter, and shared dreams, ripped apart by a brutal act of violence. The man she loved, the man she trusted, was the very one who turned on her. And the consequences would echo through the quiet streets of Tennessee for years to come. But what led to this? How did the man who vowed to protect her end up taking her life? What was the spark that ignited the horrifying tragedy? And what did the people closest to them miss, unable to see the storm that was brewing beneath the surface? Tonight, we'll unravel the chilling details of a case that not only shocked the community, but left an indelible scar on everyone involved. A case full of twists, lies, and unimaginable betrayals. Join us as we dive into the story of Kenyata Jones, a man with a dark secret, and the woman he murdered. Stay with us because this story is far from over and the truth will leave you speechless. In the quiet town of Madisonville, Tennessee, life seemed to move at a slower pace. The streets were lined with charming homes, the kind with white picket fences and blooming flower beds. Neighbors waved as they passed by, and the air was filled with the warmth of Southern hospitality. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where families grew up together and watched their children build lives of their own. It seemed idyllic, peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But beneath the surface of this small town paradise, something darker was brewing. A storm, invisible to the community, was quietly forming in the lives of one family. And when it finally erupted, it would shatter the peace of Madisonville forever. Kenyata Jones was a man who, to the outside world, had it all. He was well-liked, a proud husband, and father. His wife, Tamika, was his rock. Together they seemed the picture of happiness. They had been married for years, raised children, and had built a life that many would envy. They were the couple everyone else admired, their love story one that seemed to be written for the movies. To their neighbors, their friends, and their community, it was the kind of relationship you'd look at and think, this is what love is supposed to be. But like so many seemingly perfect lives, there was more hidden beneath the surface. There were cracks no one saw, secrets no one knew, and a growing tension that would eventually pull everything apart. Tamika Jones, a woman known for her infectious laugh and warm smile, had spent years supporting her husband, standing by his side through thick and thin. But somewhere along the way, something began to change in their marriage, something neither of them could see coming, yet both had to live with. Kenyata, the man who had sworn to love her and protect her, had become a stranger in their home. And no one, certainly not their closest friends or family, could have predicted the horrifying twist that was about to unfold. What happened? How did things go so wrong? What could have possibly turned the man she loved into someone capable of taking her life? Was this an isolated incident, or were there signs that no one paid attention to? In the days leading up to the tragedy, there was something off in the air. The whispers, the unease, the way Kenyata and Tamika seemed distant, though no one could pinpoint it exactly. Did others notice the tension between them, the cracks in their relationship? Did anyone suspect that this picture-perfect couple was on the edge of destruction? Was there a breaking point, or was it something that had been building for years? Could Tamika have seen it coming? Could Kenyata? And what about the friends who knew them best, the neighbors who saw them every day? Why didn't anyone see the storm on the horizon? Could they have done something to stop it? The answer lies in the quiet unraveling of their lives. Their lives. In the days leading up to that fateful night in September 2022, things seemed off. Kenyata, usually calm and collected, had started acting differently. There were rumors, whispers behind closed doors about arguments, cold silences, and missed opportunities for connection. Tamika had seemed distant, too. Had she known something was coming? Had she sensed the darkness taking root in the man who once promised to love her forever? For those who knew them best, the questions started to mount. What happened that night? Oh, what could have driven Kenyata to commit such an unspeakable act? How did everything go so terribly wrong? It's easy to think of murder as something that happens in a distant place, far away from your own home, your own life. But in a small town like Madisonville, it's impossible to imagine that something so brutal could happen in your own backyard. What drives a man to murder his wife? And why did it happen here in this quiet, tight-knit community? As the investigation into Tamika Jones's death unfolded, more questions than answers emerged. Those closest to the couple were left grappling with the same baffling realization. Could the man they thought they knew truly be capable of such a crime? What pushed Kenyata to this point? Was there a specific incident, a turning point, or was the violence always there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt? Was it anger, betrayal, desperation, something much deeper than what anyone could have imagined? As the authorities pieced together the events leading up to the murder, even they were stunned by the layers of deception and emotion involved. Kenyata's story didn't line up with the evidence. There were inconsistencies, contradictions, and moments where the truth seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. Why was he so calm in the hours after the murder? Why did his behavior seem so out of place for someone who had just committed such a horrific act? The more investigators dug, the more troubling questions surfaced. Was this an isolated act of violence, or was there something darker at play? Something far deeper and more unsettling than anyone could have predicted? How much do we really know about the people we love, the ones we trust? And how far can a person be pushed before they crack under the pressure of their own secrets and lies? As the story of Kenyata and Tamika Jones unfolds, it becomes clear that things are never as simple as they seem. Beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, there were cracks that no one saw, cracks that led to a deadly and tragic conclusion. The questions still remain. How much do we really know about the people closest to us? Could this tragedy have been prevented? And what is the price of trust when it's betrayed in the most unimaginable way? Stay with us. The answers are closer than you think, and the truth is far more twisted than anyone could have ever imagined. Before the tragedy, Tamika Jones was everything anyone could want in a partner. kind, vibrant, and driven by an unshakable love for life. Her smile lit up rooms, and her laughter was contagious. To those who knew her, she was more than just a wife or mother. She was a force of nature. Born and raised in a small town outside of Nashville, Tamika had always been the kind of person who believed in chasing her dreams, no matter how big or small. She had an infectious energy, one that made everyone around her feel like they could accomplish anything. There was a lightness to her spirit, a warmth that made it easy to love her, to trust her. She made friends easily and could carry on a conversation with anyone, anywhere. But it wasn't just her outward persona that drew people in. It was the depth of her heart, the way she saw the world, a place full of possibilities, a place where dreams could be turned into reality. Growing up, Tamika had always been a passionate soul. She was deeply connected to her family and friends, fiercely protective of those she loved. She had big dreams, dreams of travel, of adventure, of making a difference in the world. She was an artist at heart, a woman who expressed herself through creativity, through painting, through her music, and even through her culinary skills. She found joy in the small things, whether it was cooking a meal for the people she loved, painting a canvas with bold colors, or simply watching a sunset. Tamika had a quiet, yet powerful, way of living life that made everyone around her feel seen, heard, and valued. Her love for Kenyata was deep, sincere, and full of hope. She believed in the idea of forever, of growing old together, of building a life full of love and shared dreams. Tamika's love for Kenyata was everything she had ever wanted in a partner. Their relationship started like something out of a fairy tale. They met through mutual friends at a local gathering, a chance encounter that soon turned into something more. Tamika, with her carefree nature, was drawn to Kenyata's calm confidence. He was charismatic in his own quiet way, always the listener, always the steady presence in a room. He admired Tamika's creativity and zest for life, while she appreciated his stability and ambition. In the beginning, their connection felt effortless, like two souls who had always been meant to find one another. Their courtship blossomed quickly. Late-night talks, spontaneous road trips, and shared laughter marked the early days of their relationship. So, Kenyata was patient and kind, always supportive of Tamika's dreams, always eager to cheer her on. They shared a love for music, for the outdoors, and for adventure. Tamika would often talk about her dreams of traveling the world, of seeing the places she had only read about in books, and Kenyata would smile, promising her they would do it all together. They married young, both convinced that they had found the love of a lifetime. The small wedding ceremony was a reflection of their love, intimate, filled with close friends and family, and brimming with hope for the future. It was the perfect beginning, or so they thought. Their life together on the outside seemed idyllic. They built a life in a comfortable home in Madisonville, Tennessee, a small town where everyone knew everyone else. The house was modest, but full of love. Family photos covered the walls, each frame a reminder of the memories they had shared. They had children, a daughter and a son, both of whom brought immeasurable joy to their lives. Their home was a place of laughter and warmth. It was where Tamika painted in the mornings, where Kenyata worked from home on his small business ventures. They spent their weekends exploring the nearby countryside, going on family hikes, or simply enjoying the quiet peace of their surroundings. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, the perfect family. No one could have imagined the storm that was slowly gathering behind closed doors. Yet as the years went on, subtle changes began to emerge. At first, they were easy to ignore, overlooked in the rush of daily life. Kenyata, once a patient and understanding husband, started becoming more distant. It was small things at first, late nights at work, less time spent with the family. Tamika would brush it off, telling herself he was just busy, that it was nothing to worry about. She knew that marriage wasn't always easy and that relationships went through ups and downs. But as the months passed, those little moments of tension began to grow. There were arguments, short exchanges that hinted at something deeper, something that neither of them wanted to confront. Tamika began to feel the distance between them grow. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a change in Kenyata's demeanor. He was more irritable, less patient. Less patient. His smiles didn't quite reach his eyes anymore, and when they talked, it often felt like they were speaking past each other, not to each other. At first, Tamika attributed it to stress, work, the pressures of life, the weight of parenting two young children. Once she believed that time would heal whatever was making them both feel uneasy. But as the months went by, the tension only mounted. Small disagreements, once easily brushed aside, now turned into full-blown arguments. And Kenyata, who had once been so calm, began to raise his voice in anger. And Tamika, who had always been the peacemaker, found herself shutting down, retreating into silence. There were moments when she tried to reach out to him, to get him to talk about what was really going on. But Kenyata withdrew further. The walls he had once built around her heart grew higher, and the space between them seemed to grow wider with each passing day. Still, neither of them truly understood what was happening beneath the surface. Tamika began to suspect that there was something more, something that Kenyata wasn't telling her, but she couldn't bring herself to ask the hard questions. It felt like a slow erosion of everything they had built together. But even then, Tamika refused to believe it could come to something so violent, so final. She believed in their love, believed in the man she had married. She convinced herself that they could work through it, that everything would be okay. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, the cracks in their marriage deepened. Kenyata's behavior became more erratic. There were nights when he came home late, reeking of alcohol, his temper sharper than ever. Tamika would lie awake, listening to the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floors, wondering who he had become. She would try to talk to him, but his answers were always vague, dismissive, and filled with half-truths. There were no more promises of adventure, no more talks of their future together. It was as if he had given up on the man he once was. Still, Tamika tried to make it work. She held on to the belief that love could heal everything. She took solace in the quiet moments when they would sit together, side by side, watching their children play. Those moments gave her hope. Hope that they could rebuild, that they could find their way back to each other. But little did she know, those brief moments of peace were the calm before the storm. And then, the tipping point came. A small argument, something that should have been trivial, but it escalated into something more. The words were harsh, the tone sharper than before. Tamika tried to walk away, to avoid the confrontation, but Kenyata wouldn't let her go. The anger in his eyes, the venom in his voice, it was the first time Tamika saw a side of him she didn't recognize. For a brief moment, she felt a chill, a coldness in the air that made her shiver. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But even in that moment of clarity, she couldn't bring herself to leave. She didn't want to believe that this man, the man she loved, could be capable of such violence. But as the night wore on, the tension in the air thickened. Kenyata's behavior grew more unpredictable, his movements erratic. The warmth that once existed between them was gone, replaced by something colder, something more dangerous. The love that had once bound them together had dissolved, leaving behind only fear and confusion. And Tamika, despite everything, still didn't understand what was happening, what had become of the man she once knew. In the moments before the tragedy, Kenyata's behavior was a stark contrast to the man he had once been. The small arguments, the subtle signs of trouble, were no longer insignificant. They were the pieces of a puzzle that, once put together, revealed something horrifying. Tamika didn't know it yet, but the man she had loved, her partner, her confidant, was about to betray her in the most unimaginable way. What had led Kenyata to commit such an act? What drove him to take the life of the woman he had once sworn to love and protect? Could this tragedy have been avoided? The answers, as always, are not as simple as they seem. But one thing was certain: no one, not even Tamika, could have predicted the devastating turn their lives would take. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the dark truths behind the murder of Tamika Jones, because nothing in their seemingly perfect life was ever what it appeared to be. In the days leading up to the murder, something shifted. Tamika, though always the optimist, began to feel the weight of an unsettling presence in her home. The man she had married, the man who had once promised her forever, was becoming increasingly distant, colder. She had tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the stress of life, the routine pressures of parenting, work, and day-to-day responsibilities. But deep down, Tamika knew something was off. She could feel the distance between them growing with each passing day. And though she tried to push those feelings aside, a nagging thought kept repeating in her mind. What had happened to the man she once knew? Tamika's instincts told her that the love they had shared was slipping through their fingers, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hold on to it. She wondered if Kenyata even noticed. He had become unpredictable, his temper flaring over the smallest things and then just as quickly retreating into silence. His usual calm was replaced with something darker. She could see it in his eyes, the flicker of something unrecognizable, a coldness that made her skin prickle. But Tamika wasn't the kind to confront problems head-on. Little did she know, the situation was far worse than she could have imagined. In the days leading up to September 17th, 2022, their once vibrant home was filled with tension. Conversations became brief, strained. Kenyata would disappear for hours, saying he was working late or out with friends. Tamika tried to push past it to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but the cracks were impossible to ignore. The arguments were becoming more frequent. The small, petty disagreements they used to laugh off now spiraled into shouting matches. At first, Tamika told herself it was just stress, that their marriage had weathered challenges before. But there was something in the air now, something thick and suffocating. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt the change, the feeling that they were both teetering on the edge. The first major argument that escalated the tension took place just days before the tragedy. It started, like many of their arguments, with something small. Kenyata had been late coming home again, and Tamika, already exhausted from her day, snapped at him. At him. The words were harsh, but they were nothing new. What was different, though, was Kenyata's response. Instead of retreating into silence or brushing it off like he usually did, he lashed out. The anger in his voice was sharp and unrestrained. Tamika had never seen him like this before. He was yelling, accusing her of being too controlling, too demanding. It was as if the man she had known, the man she had shared her life with, was suddenly gone, replaced by someone unfamiliar. The argument spiraled quickly, and Tamika, in frustration, raised her voice to match his. The air between them was thick with unresolved tension. But it wasn't just the argument that shook her, it was his eyes. There was something behind them that she had never seen before. Coldness, a stone-like gaze that felt distant, devoid of warmth. Kenyata didn't look like a man who was angry or frustrated. He looked like a man who had already made up his mind about something. Something dark, something final. For the first time, Tamika felt a chill run down her spine, as if she had seen the real Kenyata, the one buried deep beneath the surface, the one she didn't know. In the following days, the atmosphere at home grew even more strained. Kenyata's behavior continued to escalate. He began coming home later and later, and when he did, he was often drunk. His presence in their home felt suffocating, like a storm on the horizon. He no longer bothered to hide the growing tension between them. And neither did Tamika. Asking about his day stopped inquiring about the late nights, the unexplained absences. She knew he wouldn't answer. The secrets that had been hidden behind the smiles and promises were now becoming too large to ignore. Tamika felt the change in their dynamic, the shift from partners in life to two strangers living under the same roof. There was an uncomfortable silence between them now, punctuated only by the occasional argument. But in the midst of all this, she still tried to hold on. She tried to salvage what they had, believing deep down that love could repair what was broken. She tried to make dinner, to keep the family together, to pretend everything was fine, even when it wasn't. As the days wore on, Tamika began to sense that something was not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. Kenyata's moods were unpredictable. One moment he was distant and cold. The next, he was apologizing for his behavior. His apologies felt empty, as though they were said only because it was expected, not because he truly felt remorse. Tamika tried to believe in the good in him, but the cracks in their marriage were growing too large to ignore. She had no idea, though, that what was coming would be the culmination of years of unresolved tension, buried secrets, and painful lies. The night before the murder, Kenyata was unusually calm. Too calm. Tamika noticed his strange behavior as he returned home later than usual, his eyes still heavy from the alcohol. But this time, something felt different. He didn't seem angry or confrontational. He didn't shout. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen table, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands trembling slightly. Tamika stood at the counter, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had learned by now not to push him, not to ask too many questions. But the silence between them felt suffocating. like a thick fog that had settled over the house. The tension in the air was unbearable. Every step they took felt like it could set off an explosion. What was happening in Kenyata's mind? Why was he behaving this way? Tamika had no answers, and the unknown was starting to eat at her. Was it the stress of life, the pressure of everything piling on him, or was there something far more sinister happening beneath the surface? And then, on September 17th, the unthinkable happened. It was just another evening. At least that's how it started. A normal evening in their home. But as the day went on, small things began to feel off. The phone calls Kenyata received, the strange glances he gave her when he thought she wasn't looking. The tension in the house was palpable. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of unspoken words, unaddressed feelings. The cracks were no longer small, they were gaping, and they were starting to swallow everything they had built together. And then that night, it all came to a head. The argument that had been brewing for weeks, months even, finally exploded. This time, there was no walking away from it, no pretending. Kenyata snapped, his rage, something Tamika had only caught glimpses of before, was unleashed. Ferg. And in the heat of that moment, something irrevocable happened. Something that would leave Tamika's life shattered and her family's world forever changed. What happened in those final moments? What triggered the violence that no one saw coming? The answers lie within the sequence of events leading to that night, but the real question is, how well did anyone truly know Kenyata? And was there more to his rage than anyone could have guessed? The timeline of the murder is still unfolding, piece by piece, as the investigation begins to reveal secrets, lies, and motives hidden behind the doors of their home. And in the end, it begs the question, could this tragedy have been prevented? Was there a sign they missed? A moment where it all could have been stopped? It was a quiet evening in the Jones household when the unthinkable happened. The house, usually filled with warmth and the hum of daily life, was now eerily silent, save for the faint creak of floorboards beneath, heavy footsteps. Kenyata stood in the kitchen, his back turned to the doorway, the dim light casting a long shadow across the room. Tamika was just a few steps behind him, her face a mixture of frustration and fear. The tension that had built between them for weeks had finally reached its breaking point. This was the moment when their world would change forever. Their argument had started small, just like the others before it. But this time, something was different. This time, the words they exchanged carried weight, the kind of weight that makes the heart race, that makes the air feel thick with impending doom. Kenyata's voice had been raised, sharper than usual, accusing her of things she couldn't understand. He was angry, but it was more than that. His anger was focused, intense, a simmering rage that had been buried deep inside him for so long. Tamika, desperate to make sense of it all, tried to reason with him. She pleaded with him, her voice breaking, begging him to stop, to listen. But the words she spoke only seemed to fuel the fire. The calm, gentle man she had once loved was slipping away, replaced by someone else, someone she didn't recognize. And then, in one swift motion, it happened. Without warning, Kenyata lunged toward her. The rage in his eyes was unmistakable now. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was something much darker. With a force that took Tamika completely by surprise, he shoved her. She stumbled backward, crashing into the kitchen counter. The blow was violent, unexpected, a stark contrast to the man she had once known. Tamika gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she tried to regain her balance. For a moment, she hesitated, trying to process what had just happened. She looked up at him, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a disagreement. This wasn't something they could fix with words. He was lost, and the man she had married was no longer standing in front of her. The next moments unfolded with terrifying speed. Kenyata advanced toward her, his movements quick and deliberate. Shh. The sound of her breath, ragged with fear, filled the room as she backed away. She stumbled, trying to get to the phone, trying to call for help. But it was too late. He grabbed her, stronger than she had ever imagined. In an instant, he was on top of her, his hands around her throat. Tamika struggled, gasping for air, her hands pushing at his chest, her nails digging into his skin as she fought to break free. Her vision blurred as the world around her began to spin. Her heart raced, but her strength was fading fast. Desperation surged through her as she realized she couldn't break free. This wasn't just an argument gone wrong. This was a fight for her life. The struggle seemed to last forever, but in reality, it was only a few minutes that would change everything. Tamika's hands, once clawing at Kenyata's chest, fell limp. Her body went still, and the fight left her. The final breath left her lungs, and with it, the life she had fought so hard to protect. And then, just as quickly as the violence had erupted, it was over. The silence in the room was suffocating. Kenyata stood over her, panting heavily, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His eyes were vacant, almost hollow, as if he were still processing the reality of what had just happened. But there was no remorse, no apology, only an empty look that said it all. The man who had once promised to love her had just taken her life, and now he stood there, unsure of what to do next. In the minutes that followed, Kenyata's next move was crucial. Did he immediately realize the gravity of what he had done? Did he try to cover it up? Or did he stay in that state of shock, unsure of what had just happened? To anyone who looked at him, his actions might have seemed like the chaotic response of a man overwhelmed by emotion. But was that the truth? Or was there something more calculated at play here? What Kenyata did next would begin to unravel the mystery of that night. At first, Kenyata seemed frozen in place, as if waiting for some sort of sign, some kind of clarity to wash over him. He stood there for a few moments, staring at Tamika's lifeless form. Then, without warning, he moved. He reached for his phone, dialing emergency services, his voice strangely calm, detached. His words came slowly, almost as if he were unsure of how to phrase them. My wife! She's unconscious, he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. I think she collapsed. Phone, the dispatcher on the other end of the line, didn't hear the urgency in his voice. They didn't hear the coldness that had taken root in his words. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't screaming for help. There was no sign of the emotional man that Tamika had once known. He wasn't just a husband in distress. He was a man trying to cover up something far darker. And the longer he spoke, the more the pieces started to fall into place for the investigators. When the police arrived, they found Kenyata in a daze, his demeanor cold and distant. Oh, He explained his story that Tamika had collapsed after a brief argument. He said she had fallen to the ground unconscious and he hadn't been able to wake her. It seemed like an innocent enough story until they started questioning him further. The police, experienced in reading the signs of someone trying to cover up a crime, didn't buy it. His calmness struck them as odd. His lack of emotion, in contrast to the situation at hand, sent up red flags. The house, which had once been full of love and laughter, now seemed empty. His wife was dead, and there was no sign of the panic that should have been there. No screams, no frantic attempts to save her life. The calmness in Kenyata's voice didn't match the gravity of what had just transpired. Something didn't add up. As the investigation began, detectives noticed the inconsistencies in Kenyata's story. His details didn't add up. He had claimed that he was in the living room when Tamika collapsed, but there were no signs of struggle, no attempt to help her. His story lacked urgency. There was no desperation, no panic, only a detached recounting of what had happened. It was almost as if he had rehearsed it, as if he had been expecting this moment. The truth, as always, was hidden behind a mask of lies. The deeper they dug, the more they began to question Kenyata's version of events. His actions after the murder spoke volumes. Was this truly the act of a man in shock? Or was this the calculated move of a man who knew exactly what he had done and what he needed to do next to cover it up? The police would spend the next few days unraveling the truth of what had happened in the Jones home. But the first signs of doubt were clear. Something was missing from Kenyata's story. Something that couldn't be explained away by stress or by panic or by the simple act of an innocent man caught off guard. What really happened in that kitchen that night? And would Kenyata's actions reveal the cold truth behind his wife's murder? When the police arrived at the scene, there was an overwhelming sense of urgency in the air. Tamika was gone, and her husband Kenyata was sitting there, too calm, too collected. The detectives who walked into the Jones household that night were seasoned professionals, trained to spot the subtle signs of deception. They knew something wasn't right, but they also knew the importance of staying objective. At this point, they couldn't be sure if they were dealing with a grieving husband or a cold-blooded killer. They had to be methodical. Detective Amelia Carter, a veteran investigator with over 15 years of experience, was the first to take the lead. She had worked hundreds of homicide cases, but something about this one felt different. The scene was too quiet, too composed. When she entered the living room, she saw Kenyata sitting with his hands folded, his eyes focused but distant. His story was simple enough. Tamika had collapsed after an argument, and he had tried but failed to revive her. It was a story that could have been plausible if it hadn't been for the details that didn't add up. From the very beginning, Detective Carter felt there was something off about Kenyata's account. He didn't seem shaken by the death of his wife. In fact, his level of composure was unnerving. There were no tears, no signs of panic, just a cold calmness that didn't sit right. Carter had seen enough to know that the emotional responses to such a tragedy were rarely so composed, especially when the victim was a wife, a mother, a partner. The more she listened to Kenyata speak, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Zoe Kenyata told the officers that the argument had been minor, that they had exchanged a few heated words, and then it was over. But when asked about the details, his story became more convoluted. First, he said Tamika had collapsed on the floor, but then he admitted that he had been in another room when it happened, unable to reach her in time. When asked why he hadn't attempted to call for help sooner, Kenyata shrugged it off, saying he was too overwhelmed to think clearly. But this was a man who had time to call 911. His composure seemed too calculated for someone who had just witnessed his wife's sudden collapse. The more Detective Carter asked, the more Kenyata's responses seemed rehearsed, robotic, almost. As the interrogation continued, Carter couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. How had Tamika died? The crime scene was eerily devoid of evidence of any kind of struggle. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood spatter in the hallway or on the furniture, nothing that would suggest a violent attack had taken place. The house was too neat, too orderly for something as horrific as a murder to have occurred just hours before. It was as if the calm had settled back into the space after the storm had passed. But was it the calm of a grieving husband or the calm of someone who knew exactly what had happened and was trying to make it look like an accident? The initial forensic reports only deepened the mystery. Vowed. The cause of death was listed as asphyxiation, but there were no bruises, no marks around Tamika's neck to suggest she had been strangled. There were no defensive wounds either, no signs that she had fought back, which made the situation all the more puzzling. How had she died? The forensic team would need to look deeper to understand exactly what had happened in that kitchen. But the absence of clear signs of violence made the case even harder to crack. Detective Carter wasn't the only one questioning Kenyata's version of events. The neighbors, too, began to offer strange and conflicting statements. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down, said she had heard raised voices coming from the Jones home earlier that evening. She couldn't make out the words, but she remembered the tone of the argument. It was sharp, heated. But when she asked her husband, Mr. Patterson, about it, he didn't recall hearing anything at all. Yet Mrs. Patterson had mentioned something curious. She said that just before the argument started, she had seen Kenyata and Tamika standing on their porch, talking quietly as if they were preparing to leave the house. She had seen Kenyata's car parked in the driveway, the engine running, as though they were planning to go somewhere. But according to Kenyata's own account, he and Tamika had been in the house the entire evening, only arguing after dinner. The story didn't align with the timeline provided by the neighbors. Then there was Sarah, a close friend of Tamika's, who spoke to the police just hours after the body was discovered. Sarah had known Kenyata and Tamika for years, and she too felt the shift in their relationship in recent months. According to Sarah, Tamika had confided in her on multiple occasions about the growing strain in her marriage. She had noticed that Kenyata seemed distant, withdrawn, and sometimes even cold toward her. There had been no signs of violence leading up to the murder, but Sarah felt Tamika had been trying to hold it all together, almost as if she were preparing for something, though she didn't know exactly what. There were no concrete signs of abuse, no clear indications that Tamika had been in any immediate danger, but the whispers of concern from those closest to her added weight to the growing sense of doubt surrounding Kenyata's account. So, the more they dug into Kenyata's background, the more conflicting information began to surface. Kenyata was well liked by his community, but he had a history of minor run-ins with the law. Nothing serious, just a few instances of public disturbances, alcohol-related offenses. It wasn't enough to suggest anything violent, but it raised a question. Did Kenyata have a temper? Was his outward calmness a mask for something more dangerous? Or was this simply the behavior of a man overwhelmed by stress, pushed to a breaking point? The day after the murder, Detective Carter and her team met with the forensic experts, going over the initial findings. They had done a preliminary examination of the scene and found something that, while not immediately obvious, began to raise questions. There was a faint scent of bleach in the kitchen, not overpowering, but noticeable. The sink, usually a mess of dirty dishes, had been cleaned carefully, thoroughly. A typical sign of someone trying to remove traces of something or someone. Could Kenyata have been trying to clean up the evidence of a struggle? There were no fingerprints on the glass of the door, no marks on the counter, and nothing to suggest Tamika had tried to defend herself. But the absence of evidence didn't necessarily mean innocence. It was possible that Kenyata had planned the act, making sure to cover his tracks before he even called 911. The more they investigated, the more they uncovered troubling signs. Small things that, when pieced together, began to paint a far darker picture. The deeper the investigation went, the more layers of deception were uncovered. In the days following the murder, Kenyata's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spoke to his friends and family, trying to appear grief-stricken, but his responses were flat, lacking the raw emotion one would expect. Was he truly in shock? Or was this another carefully calculated act? As more evidence came in, and more people came forward with their stories, the investigators were left with one glaring question. Was Kenyata's calm composure a result of grief? Or was it the mask of a man who had carefully orchestrated his wife's death? The investigation was only just beginning, and the truth, whatever it may be, was buried beneath layers of lies, conflicting stories, and a mountain of questions. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the real question remained, was this a tragic accident, or had Kenyata Jones planned the unthinkable? The investigation into Tamika Jones's death had been progressing steadily, but the breakthrough the detectives had been hoping for seemed just out of reach. That was until one fateful afternoon, when a crucial piece of evidence surfaced, an anonymous tip-off that would change everything. It came from a source who had been keeping an eye on Kenyata's social media activity, noticing something strange in the days following Tamika's death. The tipster had been tracking Kenyata's phone records, observing unusual calls and text messages that contradicted his initial statements. But it wasn't just the unusual patterns. It was the content of these messages that caught the attention of the investigators. The pattern was unmistakable. Kenyata had been in contact with someone who was not just a friend, someone who had a much deeper connection to him. The name that appeared in these messages wasn't one the police had been expecting. It was a woman a woman with whom Kenyata had been having an affair. Detective Carter and her team quickly followed the trail, connecting the dots between Kenyata's relationship with his wife and his secret affair. This was the missing piece they hadn't anticipated, the revelation that Kenyata had been leading a double life. He had maintained his image as the perfect husband, the doting father, but behind closed doors, he had been betraying the woman who had trusted him with her life. The affair, it seemed, had been going on for months, possibly longer. But this wasn't just about infidelity. No, there was something much deeper at play. The investigation soon revealed that Kenyata had been facing mounting financial struggles. Debt was piling up, and the life he had once projected, a life of stability and success, was beginning to crumble. As the weight of his secret affair and financial ruin began to bear down on him, his resentment toward Tamika grew. He no longer saw her as the woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin. She had become an obstacle he could no longer afford to have in his life. The detectives now understood Kenyata's motives were far more complex than anyone had imagined. The affair, the financial pressures, the growing resentment, all these factors had been building up in him. And in that moment of anger, they had driven him to make a decision that would haunt him forever. It was becoming clear that Tamika had been more than just a victim of a heated argument. She had been the victim of a calculated act. Kenyata had been planning it for some time, waiting for the right moment when his emotions would boil over, when he could rid himself of the woman who represented everything he was trying to escape. She was a reminder of a life he could no longer afford to live. The perfect wife, the perfect family, the perfect facade had all been slowly unraveling, and when it finally did, Kenyata snapped. But the bombshell didn't end there. As the detectives continued to examine Kenyata's phone records, they found something that would finally crack the case wide open. A phone call. A phone call. A phone call that took place just moments before Tamika's murder. The call was short, but the content was chilling. It was made to the woman he had been having the affair with, and the timing of it couldn't have been more telling. In the call, Kenyata sounded almost eerily calm, as if he were preparing for something. The woman on the other end of the line seemed to offer words of comfort, but her tone wasn't one of concern. It was strangely supportive. The detectives could hear Kenyata whispering to her, saying things like, "It's done. It's finally done. She's gone." At that moment, it became crystal clear. Kenyata had planned Tamika's murder, and he had done it with the full knowledge that he would be able to get away with it. The affair, the financial struggles, and the resentment had all been building toward this moment, a moment of finality. As the investigators pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle, they confronted Kenyata with the evidence they had uncovered. It was time to confront him. His composure, so calculated in the days following Tamika's death, finally cracked as the full weight of his actions came to light. Sitting across from Detective Carter, Kenyata seemed to shrink in the chair. For the first time, his calm facade shattered. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "You don't have to keep lying," Detective Carter said softly. "All we know about the affair. We know about the phone call, we know about the debt, and we know what you did." The confession, when it finally came, wasn't a loud one. It was quiet, almost inaudible. Kenyata sat there, staring down at the table, his hands trembling as he finally admitted to everything. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, but she didn't understand. She didn't get it. I couldn't keep pretending anymore." His voice was hollow, regretful, but there was no real emotion behind it. It was as if he had been rehearsing these words in his head. 4 days, months even. "I just wanted out. I thought I could start over. I didn't think she would ever see it coming." The moment of confession was the culmination of everything the investigators had suspected. Kenyata had murdered Tamika not in a fit of rage, but with cold calculation. He had been planning her death for weeks, if not months, knowing exactly how to make it look like an accident, knowing exactly how to cover his tracks. The affair, the debt, the resentment, these were the motives that had driven him to kill the woman he had once loved. For the confession, while devastating, didn't bring Tamika back. It didn't undo the heartbreak her family was now forced to endure, but it did bring some semblance of closure to the case. And for the community of Madisonville, it was the final revelation that shattered the image of the perfect husband. The revelation sent shockwaves through the town. Kenyata, the man they had all known as the devoted husband and father, was now seen for who he truly was. A man who had lied, manipulated, and ultimately killed to escape the life he had built. The community, once united in its admiration for Kenyata, was now left in disbelief. How had they not seen the signs? How had they missed the truth? Media outlets quickly picked up the story, with reporters camping outside the courthouse as Kenyata's trial date approached. The case became a sensation, spreading like wildfire across the nation. People couldn't get enough of the shocking details. The affair, the financial ruin, the lies. It seemed that the perfect family was nothing more than an illusion. For Tamika's family, the public reaction was a double-edged sword. While the truth had finally come to light, it was a truth that they never wanted to hear. The shock and grief were unbearable. They had lost their daughter, their sister, in the most unimaginable way. The truth is, and now the world knew the ugly truth about the man who had taken her from them. As Kenyata's trial continued, the community remained in shock, still trying to process the dark secrets that had been hidden beneath the surface. But for those who loved Tamika, the battle was far from over. The fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was filled with an air of tension that could be cut with a knife. The day had finally come. Kenyata Jones was going to stand trial for the murder of his wife, Tamika. The world was watching, waiting to see what would unfold in the coming days. Every eye in the room was focused on Kenyata, whose composed demeanor seemed almost out of place for a man accused of such a heinous crime. His face was impassive, giving nothing away as he sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. The prosecution had one goal: to show the jury the true face of Kenyata Jones. They weren't just trying to convict him of his wife's murder. They were trying to expose the lies, the manipulation, and the cold, calculated nature of his actions. They knew that getting a conviction would be difficult, that there would be a fight ahead of them. But they were determined to bring Tamika justice, no matter how much Kenyata tried to hide behind his carefully crafted defense. The defense, led by the experienced attorney Thomas Hale, wasn't about to make things easy for the prosecution. From the very beginning, Hale made it clear that his client wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. He was a man who had been pushed to his breaking point. Oh, his breaking point. His argument wasn't simple, and it wasn't particularly convincing to some in the room, but it was clear that Hale would stop at nothing to protect his client. In his opening statement, Hale portrayed Kenyata as a victim of circumstance, a man who, after years of marriage, had found himself trapped in an unrelenting spiral of financial ruin, personal disappointment, and mounting emotional stress. According to Hale, Kenyata had not meant to kill Tamika. Instead, he had acted in self-defense when she became physically aggressive during an argument that escalated unexpectedly. Hale argued that Kenyata had been forced into a corner and, in a desperate attempt to protect himself, he struck out. The death, Hale claimed, was tragic, but not intentional. Oz tragic, but not intentional. The prosecution was quick to respond. Lead prosecutor Elizabeth Hayes was a seasoned trial attorney, known for her ability to make even the most hardened criminals break down under cross-examination. She wasn't about to let Hale's narrative stand. In her opening statement, Hayes painted a very different picture. She didn't just want to show that Kenyata had killed his wife. She wanted the jury to understand the darkness inside him, the resentment and the rage that had built up over months, if not years. This is not a case of self-defense, Hayes declared, her voice firm, her eyes sweeping across the jury. This is the case of a man who no longer wanted to be married. This is the case of a man who chose to take his wife's life because he saw her as an obstacle to his freedom, to his desires. And in that moment, when everything came crashing down, he decided he would not let her leave him. He took her life without a second thought. The room was silent as Hayes's words hung in the air. She then proceeded to introduce the key evidence that would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. The phone records, the affair, the mounting debts, and the coldness in Kenyata's actions immediately after the murder. The first day of the trial was just the beginning, but the prosecution had already laid the groundwork for a compelling case. They didn't need to rely on just the facts. They needed to show the jury who Kenyata was as a person. And they began with a crucial piece of evidence that would haunt him throughout the trial: his own actions in the hours after Tamika's death. When Kenyata had called 911, his voice had been strangely calm. He didn't sound like a man in shock or a man who had just lost his wife. The 911 operator had noted the lack of urgency in his voice, something that stood out immediately. And then there was the matter of the phone call he had made to his mistress minutes after the murder. In the call, Kenyata had told her, almost matter-of-factly, that Tamika was gone, that it was finally over. The coldness of those words didn't match the story he had told the authorities. The prosecution also brought forward emotional testimony from Tamily. Her sister, Chantel, took the stand and described Tamika as a woman who had always put others first, who had always been there for her family, who had dreams of a future with Kenyata, even as the cracks in their marriage began to show. Chantel's testimony was emotional and raw. She spoke of the last conversation she had with Tamika, how Tamika had confided in her about the growing tension at home, the fear that she couldn't shake. Chantel's testimony was the first of many emotional moments in the trial. Every time someone took the stand to speak about Tamika, it was a reminder of who she had been, a woman full of life whose future had been stolen from her. And as the trial wore on, it became clear that Kenyata's actions were not just those of a man who had lost control. No, the deeper they dug, the more they realized that this was a man who had been harboring deep resentment, anger toward the very person who had loved him unconditionally. The turning points in the trial came in waves. As the prosecution presented their evidence, the defense continued to assert that Kenyata had acted in self-defense. But cracks began to form in their argument, especially when Kenyata's financial struggles were revealed in full. Evidence of large unpaid debts, along with the mounting pressure of his affair, painted a portrait of a man who was desperate for a way out, desperate to live the life he had always wanted without the burden of responsibility or consequence. But the most shocking moment came when a key witness, a close friend of Kenyata's, took the stand. The witness, John Matthews, a man who had known Kenyata for years, was the one person who seemed to know the darkest secrets of Kenyata's life. Matthews revealed that Kenyata had been talking about divorce long before Tamika's death. He had made it clear to his friends that he no longer wanted to be married, that he didn't want to keep living a lie. The moment Matthews spoke these words, it was like a bombshell had been dropped in the courtroom. The defense, who had tried so hard to paint Kenyata as a man trapped in an unbearable situation, had just lost their strongest argument. The defense tried to backpedal, but it was too late. The jury had heard everything they needed to hear. Kenyata wasn't a victim of circumstance. He wasn't a man who had acted out of desperation in a moment of panic. No, he had planned Tamika's murder, and the pieces of evidence laid out by the prosecution told the story of a man who had been driven by greed, anger, and the desire for freedom. There was no self-defense. There was only premeditation. In the final days of the trial, Kenyata took the stand in his own defense, but his testimony only further damaged his case. He continued to maintain that he had acted in self-defense, but his demeanor was increasingly defensive, almost combative. His explanations were convoluted, and his responses lacked the sincerity of someone who was truly remorseful. The trial reached its final moments, and as the closing arguments were made, it was clear that the case had been decided. The jury deliberated for less than 3 days, but their verdict would be one that would change the lives of Tamika's family forever. When the verdict came, it was swift and clear. Kenyata Jones was guilty of first-degree murder. Oh, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and sorrow, the weight of the decision settling on everyone like a heavy cloak. As the gavel came down, the truth was finally out. Kenyata had taken the life of the woman he had once promised to love, and he would now pay the price for his actions. The emotional toll on Tamika's family was immeasurable, but at least now they had the justice they had been fighting for. The trial was over. But for those who loved Tamika, the pain would never truly fade. The finality of the verdict didn't erase the years they had lost with her. It didn't bring her back, but it gave them something that Kenyata could never take away: the truth. The trial had reached its final chapter. After weeks of testimony, emotional witness statements, and the dramatic turn of events, it all came down to this moment. The moment the families, the community, and the entire courtroom had been waiting for. The verdict. Kenyata Jones, the man who had once been a pillar in his community, sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. The weight of the trial had taken its toll on him. His earlier composure had faltered in the face of the mounting evidence against him. But now, as the jury filed back into the courtroom, there was nothing left for him to do but wait. The jury, who had deliberated for days, entered the room, their faces serious, their eyes focused. The moment had arrived. Detective Carter, the prosecution, and the defense all held their collective breath as the foreman rose, holding the envelope that would reveal Kenyata's fate. The judge, his voice steady but heavy with the gravity of the situation, called the court to order. The room was filled with a tense, suffocating silence. The clock on the wall ticked down the seconds, amplifying the waiting tension. The air was thick with anticipation, every person in the room trying to brace themselves for what was about to come. The foreman unfolded the paper, his voice steady as he spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Kenyata Jones, guilty of first-degree murder." The words echoed through the room like a thunderclap, reverberating in the hearts of everyone present. There was no gasp, no outburst, just the collective intake of breath from a room that had been waiting for this moment for so long. Some faces were filled with tears of relief, others with anger and sorrow. But everyone knew this was the moment that would define everything. The families of Tamika Jones felt the weight of that moment. For them, the trial had been an emotional roller coaster, rising and falling with every new piece of evidence, every twist in Kenyata's defense. But now, with the verdict read, they were finally able to breathe, albeit with heavy hearts. Justice, at least in this moment, had been served, but what did that truly mean? But for Kenyata's family, the verdict was a bitter pill to swallow. They had stood by him throughout the trial, believing in his innocence, convinced that the truth would come to light and that he would be exonerated. But now, as the words "guilty" echoed through the room, they were left in stunned silence. His mother, once so proud of her son, looked down at the floor, her face a mixture of grief and disbelief. The reality of the moment was too much to bear. The man she had raised, the man she had loved unconditionally, was now convicted of killing his wife. She could hardly comprehend it. Kenyata himself remained eerily composed. His expression didn't shift as the verdict was read. His eyes, vacant and distant, seemed to look through the room, focusing on nothing. His hands were clenched into fists on the table before him. But even in that moment, there was no visible sign of emotion. He had expected this. And yet there was something unsettling about the lack of reaction. He didn't seem shocked or even remorseful. It was as if he had already made peace with the inevitable. The courtroom erupted into hushed murmurs as the verdict sank in. For the first time in weeks, the tension in the room seemed to ease just slightly. But as the judge prepared to call for a short recess before sentencing, the emotional toll of the trial weighed heavily on everyone involved. For Tamika's family, the verdict was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring Tamika back. It didn't undo the pain, the loss, the years they would never get to spend with her. And for Kenyata's family, the harsh reality of the truth was more than they could bear. The sentencing would come the next day, But already the questions lingered in the air. What would Kenyata's fate be? Would he be given a chance at redemption, or would he face the full consequences of his actions? The stakes had never been higher. The following day, the courtroom was filled with tension once again. Kenyata stood before the judge, flanked by his attorneys. The prosecution and defense both made their final statements, arguing for the appropriate sentence. The prosecution was adamant that Kenyata should receive the maximum sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. They argued that his crime was one of cold, calculated murder. There was no question of self-defense. His actions had been deliberate, and he had shown no remorse for what he had done. The defense, on the other hand, begged for leniency. They argued that Kenyata was a man who had been pushed to his limits, that the stress of his financial situation, the affair, and the emotional turmoil he had faced had led him to act in a moment of overwhelming frustration. They asked for a lesser sentence, pleading for mercy on behalf of his family. As the judge listened to both sides, it became clear that the decision was not going to be an easy one. He took a moment to deliberate, the weight of his responsibility hanging over him. After what seemed like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "Kenyata Jones, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was no sound in the courtroom. Then the murmurs started. Some in the room were relieved. Justice had been served. Others, like Kenyata's family, were left in disbelief, their world crashing down around them. For Tamika's family, the sentence brought some semblance of closure. It wasn't the answer they had hoped for. Nothing could bring Tamika back. But it was the answer they had been waiting for. They had fought for justice, and now, at least in the eyes of the law, they had received it. The pain of their loss would never fade, but at least they knew that Kenyata would face the consequences of his actions. As for Kenyata, his reaction to the sentence was one of quiet resignation. He didn't scream, didn't shout. He simply nodded as if he had already accepted what was coming. His family, however, couldn't hide their shock. They had believed in his innocence, had stood by him through the entire trial. Now they were left to grapple with the fact that the man they had loved was a murderer. The community of Madisonville was left to pick up the pieces. The truth had come to light, but the pain of what had happened would linger. Kenyata Jones was now a convicted murderer, and the town would forever carry the weight of that fact. As for Tamika's family, they knew that no sentence could ever bring their beloved daughter back. But at least for now, they could say that justice had been served, even if it came too late to undo the damage that had been done. The aftermath of Tamika Jones's murder rippled through the community in ways that no one could have anticipated. Madisonville, a small town known for its tight-knit atmosphere and its seemingly peaceful way of life, had been shaken to its core. The revelation that one of their own, someone they had all known and trusted, could commit such a heinous act was unthinkable. Unthinkable. Kenyata Jones, once viewed as a pillar of the community, now stood as the embodiment of betrayal and violence. Neighbors who had once greeted him with smiles and friendly waves now looked at him with suspicion and fear. The man they had shared their lives with was a murderer, and that knowledge could not be undone. People who had known Kenyata for years couldn't reconcile the image of the family man, the father, with the man who had taken his wife's life in cold blood. The town, once united by a sense of security, was now divided by uncertainty and disbelief. Trust so easily given in a community like Madisonville had been shattered. For Tamika's family, the aftermath of the murder was no less harrowing. The pain of losing her was something that could never be fully understood by anyone outside of her family. They were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, trying to make sense of the loss. Chantel, Tamika's sister, became the voice of the family throughout the trial. She had been the one closest to Tamika, the one who had witnessed the gradual decline of her sister's marriage. But even she was left grappling with questions that had no answers. Could they have seen the signs? Could they have seen the signs? Should they have done more to intervene before it was too late? Chantel often found herself asking these questions in the quiet moments after the trial, long after the cameras had stopped rolling and the media had moved on. The pain of knowing that her sister's life had been stolen so suddenly, so violently, was something that would never leave her. But there were other emotions too: frustration, guilt, and confusion. She had always known Kenyata as a family man, someone who cared deeply for Tamika. How could he have done this? How could someone she had trusted with her sister's well-being become the very monster that took her from them? As the months passed, the family began to heal, but the scars were deep. The loss of Tamika was a wound that would never fully close. They tried to move forward, to find some semblance of peace in their lives, but it was a struggle. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone was a reminder that Tamika would never be there to celebrate with them. There was a quiet strength in the family's resolve. They had fought for justice, and now that Kenyata was behind bars, they could begin to find some sense of closure. But the pain of her absence, her laugh, her smile, the warmth she had brought into their lives, remained. It always would. In the community, the story of Kenyata's crime continued to linger long after the trial. People still whispered when his name was mentioned, still struggled to reconcile the image of the family man with the brutal reality of what had happened. And for those who had known Tamika, who had seen the love and joy she had brought to everyone around her, it was a constant reminder that the worst tragedies don't always come from people who seem dangerous. They come from the people we trust, the people closest to us, In the months following the trial, the question that lingered most in the minds of those who had been closest to Tamika and Kenyata was simple yet profound. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Could the signs of trouble in their marriage, the tension that had been building for months, have been spotted and addressed before it escalated to murder? The sad truth is that sometimes we don't know the people we love as well as we think we do. We look for signs, for warnings, but those can be hidden beneath layers of charm, of smiles, of promises. And when those layers begin to peel away, when the facade cracks, it's often too late to do anything about it. In the end, the questions remain. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone had acted sooner, if they had seen the warning signs? Or is it simply a brutal reminder that even the people we trust most can hide their darkest secrets? As we reflect on the story of Kenyata and Tamika, let us be reminded of the fragility of trust, of love, and of the lives we think we know so well. Because sometimes the people closest to us can hold the greatest dangers, and the darkest secrets are the ones we never see coming. As we close the chapter on this tragic story, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Kenyata's actions were driven by anger, fear, or something much darker? Could the signs have been spotted earlier? What do you think led to this shocking turn of events? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We dive deep into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering the chilling truths and shocking twists you won't find anywhere else. With new cases coming soon, you won't want to miss what's next. Join our growing community and stay tuned for the next chapter in our journey to uncover the truth behind the headlines. Because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that happen in our own backyards.